join me in welcoming Mr. Brette Esterbrooks.
All right, so for the last 3, 4, 5 weeks, I've been talking all about the ASP.NET Web API. We started off with a high-level question and answer about what it is, why Microsoft introduced it. We moved on a little bit more detail to talk about some of the features it has. And last week, we talked a little bit deeper about how clients can interact with our fictional Pitbull adoption site that we love. So today, I'd like to continue the conversation talking about how validation works in the ASP.NET Web API. Now, if you were to ask me, validation is one of the most tricky things we do as software developers. And when you do it in a distributed environment, it can be even more difficult. You have rules on the client, you have rules over here on the server, and somehow you have to coordinate all this with giving the user a decent user experience. Thankfully, with the Web API, we get some help. As I mentioned last week, since the API is built on top of MVC, we get a lot of the good stuff that comes along with MVC. One of those things is model binding. Anybody who understands MVC knows that part of model binding is model validation. So what that means is any of the ways that we do validation within MVC apply to the Web API. So I'd like to go through a single demonstration today, exploring a little bit how we can use some of the features from MVC to implement validation in the Web API. And I'd like to show you a quick sequence of how it's going to work. Our client makes an HTTP request to our service. That request may have some invalid data. Model binding happens. As part of model binding is model validation. If errors are found, an HTTP response is sent back to the client with a 400 bad request, with the JSON content representing the messages, the error messages that came back to the server. We then use jQuery unobtrusive to render the view and the error messages to the client. So the first example I'd like to talk about is how we can use data annotations to implement validation within the Web API. So if I go into Visual Studio here, before we delve into the code, I actually want to run this so you can see what it looks like, because it will just make going through the code quite a bit clearer. So here is the site that we kind of worked on a little bit last week. This is our list of pitbulls that are adoptable. The only difference being now we have this edit link. So when I click this, the jQuery dialog pops up. And if we go ahead and remove the name here, hit save, we get a validation here. Now this validation here actually came from the web service itself. And it says the server says the name is required. So this is kind of the interaction we're going to be looking at when we start looking at the code. Additionally, if I go ahead and make the name too long, the server has a rule that basically says the length of the name needs to be less than 25 characters. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code. And the first thing we need to look at, if we're going to be using data annotations, is our pitbull entity. This is the object that represents each of our dogs. You'll see that on top of the name property, I have added the required data annotation and the string length data annotation. This simply states that the name is required and the length of the name must be less than 25 characters. Now, if we go into the client, which is our view, we see a few things. Last week, we talked a little bit about jQuery templating. This is the jQuery template that renders our list, showing the URL, the name, and the description. So those are the list of dogs that you saw. We have an additional jQuery template that is used to populate the form itself. And this form has the name text box, description text box, and image URL text box, and the 2 buttons for cancel and save. And if we look down to when this form is submitted, we'll see on submission when the save button is clicked, we actually do an HTTP put to our pitbull service, passing along the ID and all of the form data that was entered in the form. So what brings us all together is if we go to our pitbull service, which is our pitbull controller here, and we look at the put method. This is the method that's called when that form is submitted. I showed you the jQuery put. I have on top of this an action filter. Now, action filters are another thing that we get from MVC. If you're not familiar with action filters, what they allow us to do is run a little bit of code before the action executes or before the action ends. But all this actually happens after the model binding process. So we can use a little trick here to help us with validation. If we look at this code, you can see I'm implementing the on action executing. So this means I'm going to do this before we get to that action. But like I said, this happens after model binding. And if model validation is part of model binding, that means any rules we have on our entities would have already been run. So when this action filter executes, the first thing I do is just check to see if the model is valid or invalid. If it's invalid, I take the HTTP request and I ask it to create for us a special type of error response. Now this is a new overload given to us in the web API that takes in status code. I'm choosing bad request 400 here, and the model state, which is actually the model state that we were given after model binding happened. So this is actually a collection of all of our errors. And that collection will be serialized in JSON back to the client in a way that Jquery Unobtrusive can understand it. So if I put a breakpoint here, and we go ahead and run this application again, this time if we go in and we remove all his name, go ahead and save it, you'll see our action filter is being executed here. Now at this point, model bindings happen, model validations happen, and because we have those data annotations on our name property, we are now going to have some errors. So the model state says it's invalid. So we go ahead and we create the response to send it back to the client with the 400 bad request, and Jquery Unobtrusive then does the rest of the heavy lifting, spitting out the error message for us. Now to further look at this, we can actually look at the interaction that happened in Fiddler. And you can see here, it's actually our HTTP put that sent the request to our service. And if we look at the values that were sent, you can see that we only sent the ID, we didn't send the name, and we sent the description. So because we left the name out, when we got to our action method here, the model was deemed invalid. So similarly, if we do this, and make the name too long, again, coming into our action filter, the model state is invalid. Turn that back to the client. And if we look at this request in Fiddler, see that this name exceeded the 25 characters, and thus we have the validation. So let's go ahead and rename Olive. Save her. This time, since we passed all the validation checks, model state is valid as true, and all is well in the world, and all has been named. So this is just one of the ways that we can do validation in the ASP.NET Web API. There's other ways you can do it. Jim had mentioned that I was going to be talking about the more flexible version using the iValidatable object, which allows us to basically customize any of the validation we want. One approach I like to use is using the open source framework Fluent Validation, which gives us a lot more flexibility because we get access to a lot more context when we're dealing with our rules. But I just want to wrap up with a brief summary of what we saw. Validation is really pretty simple in the ASP.NET Web API because we get all the MVC stuff for free. With model binding, we can take advantage of any of the ways we do validation in MVC, whether it be data annotations, iValidatable object. And so we get a lot of flexibility as to how we want to do that. Wrapping up, if you want to learn more about the Web API, I've showed you this link before. It's a great link with lots of examples. And I've also actually posted my code for all of the examples that I'm going to be demonstrating at MVC at that link there. So if you're interested in downloading that and looking at this further, feel free to do so. And with that, I will return the meeting to our Toastmaster, Jim Brown.